6:15 in the morning, on the 9th of March, 2026, the sun began its slow climb. Over the horizon of the Strait of Hormuz, the light was a bruised purple, bleeding into a hazy gold across the water. High above the Gulf, a United States Navy P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft cut through the thin air. The aircraft maintained a steady altitude of 28,000 feet. Below, the sea was a sheet of hammered silver. The air inside the pressurized cabin was cool and smelled of recycled oxygen and stale coffee. 9 crew members sat at their workstations, bathed in the soft blue glow of liquid crystal displays. Their headsets hummed with the constant, low-level static of long-range communications. For the crew of Combat Air Crew 11, this was the 4th hour of a standard surveillance track. They were the eyes of the 5th Fleet. Their mission was to monitor the heavy tanker traffic moving through the narrowest choke point in the world. The tactical coordinator leaned back in his seat and rubbed his eyes. The flight was smooth. The 4 jet engines of the P-8 Poseidon produced a rhythmic vibration that felt like a heartbeat through the deck. Out of the small, circular windows, the morning mist clung to the rugged coastline of Iran to the north. Everything felt routine. The mission commander checked his watch and noted the time. He adjusted his microphone. He asked the radar operator for a sweep of the northern sector. The operator tapped a sequence into his keys. The powerful radar array in the belly of the plane sent out an invisible pulse. The return was instantaneous. A single green icon flickered on the edge of the screen. It was moving fast. The operator sat up, straight. He adjusted the gain on his display. The icon was not a commercial transponder. It was a primary radar return coming from the direction of Bandar Abbas. The speed of the contact was 500 knots and climbing. It was moving at an intercept angle. The tactical coordinator watched numbers scroll across his screen. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. The casual chatter between the crew died away. The only sound was the high-pitched whine of the cooling fans. The radar operator called out the contact. He identified it as a fast mover. The altitude of the unknown aircraft was 10,000 feet. It was accelerating hard. The mission commander ordered the flight deck to bank the aircraft 10 degrees to the south. He wanted to stay in international airspace. The pilot gripped the yoke. The massive aircraft tilted, the wings slicing through the morning light. The sun flashed across the cockpit glass. The glare was blinding for a split second. The contact was now 60 miles away. It was closing the gap at a rate of 12 miles every minute. The mission commander switched his radio to the international distress frequency. He identified his aircraft as a United States Navy patrol plane. He stated they were operating in international airspace. He told the unknown aircraft to remain clear. There was no response. The silence on the radio was heavy. On the radar screen, the green icon was now 45 miles away. Its speed had increased to Mach 0.9. The tactical coordinator felt a bead of sweat roll down his neck. The cool air of the cabin now felt thick and restrictive. He checked the electronic support measures. A new warning light began to pulse on his console. It was a yellow strobe. The unknown aircraft had turned on its fire control radar. The P-8 Poseidon was being scanned. The invisible beam of the enemy radar washed over the fuselage. Inside the cabin, a low-frequency warble began to play through every headset. It was the sound of a search lock. The mission commander repeated his warning. His voice was calm but firm. He directed the warning specifically to the aircraft, approaching from the north. Still, there was no verbal reply. The radar operator confirmed the signature. It was a high-pulse repetition frequency. The crew knew that signal well. It belonged to the AN/AWG-9 radar system. Only one aircraft in the region carried that specific, aging but deadly technology. It was an Iranian F-14 Tomcat. The realization hit the crew like a physical blow. The legendary interceptor was no longer just a shadow on a map. It was a hunter. The Tomcat was now 30 miles away. It was climbing rapidly to 30,000 feet. It was positioning itself above and behind the slower patrol plane. The pilot of the P-8 pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared, but the heavy aircraft could not outrun a fighter jet. The vibrations through the floor became a violent shudder. The mission commander ordered the crew to don their life vests. He told them to secure all loose gear. The blue light of the consoles flickered as the plane banked harder. The P-8 was now a target. The morning sun was high enough to illuminate the white wake of the aircraft against the dark sea. Far below, a lone oil tanker moved slowly, unaware of the drama unfolding 5 miles above its decks. The warble in the headsets changed. The pitch became higher and more frantic. The yellow light on the console turned a steady, baleful red. The Iranian fighter had transitioned from a search to a track lock. The Persian cat had its claws out. 6:25 in the morning. The concrete at Bandar Abbas Air Base shimmered. The heat was already rising. It carried the heavy scent of unburned kerosene. In a hardened shelter, the F-14 Tomcat waited. It was a massive machine of steel and titanium. It looked like a predator at rest. The twin engines coughed. A cloud of thick gray smoke erupted from the tail. Then came the roar. It was a low-frequency thunder. It shook the ground for miles. Inside the cockpit, the pilot adjusted his mask. He checked his oxygen flow. He looked at his backseater. The radar intercept officer gave a thumbs up. The canopy slid forward. It locked with a heavy metallic click. The pilot pushed the throttles. The aircraft began to move. It rolled out onto the main taxiway. The sun reflected off the long, pointed nose. Under the fuselage, a single massive shape hung. It was the Phoenix missile. It was nearly 4 meters long. It weighed almost 500 kilograms. It was designed for one purpose. It was a long-range killer. The pilot looked toward the runway. The tower gave the clearance. No more words were needed. He slammed the throttles into full afterburner. 2 pillars of blue and orange flame punched out of the exhaust. The Tomcat surged forward. The acceleration pressed the pilot into his seat. The wings were swept forward. They gripped the thick morning air. At 150 knots, the nose rose. The aircraft left the ground. It climbed at a steep angle. The landing gear retracted with a series of thuds. The F-14 turned south. It headed toward the blue expanse of the Gulf. The pilot leveled off at 10,000 feet. He accelerated to 600 knots. The sound of the wind against the canopy was a constant scream. He adjusted the radar gain. He saw the target. It was a large, slow-moving blip. It was 60 miles away. He knew it was the American P-8 Poseidon. He had tracked them many times before. But today was different. The orders from command were clear. This was not a warning mission. It was a termination mission. The pilot felt his heart rate climb. His hands were steady on the controls. He checked his master arm switch. He flipped the cover up. He moved the toggle to the arm position. A green light illuminated on the instrument panel. The Phoenix missile was now live. The internal cooling systems of the missile began to hum. It was thirsty for a target. The pilot adjusted the sweep of his wings. They moved back into a delta shape. The aircraft became a dart. He pushed the nose down. He wanted more speed. The airspeed indicator ticked upward. Mach 0.8. Mach 0.9. The sonic boom cracked over the water. It sent a shockwave across the waves. The pilot looked at the radar screen again. The target was 40 miles away. The P-8 was turning. It was trying to run, but it was too slow. It was a whale trying to escape a shark. The distance closed rapidly. 35 miles. 30 miles. The pilot looked at the fire control display. The diamond symbol locked onto the target. It began to flash. The heat in the cockpit was intense. The sun beat down through the glass. The smell of sweat and rubber filled the pilot's mask. He breathed deeply and slowly. He waited for the tone. He was the master of this sky. The American plane was an intruder. It was a ghost from a distant land. Now, it would become a memory. He reached for the launch button on the stick. His thumb hovered over the cold metal. The sky was a perfect, pitiless blue. 6:32 in the morning. The P-8 Poseidon maintained its steady track over the dark blue water. The sun was now a blinding white disk just above the horizon. Inside the darkened tube of the aircraft, the radar operator stared at his screen. The green sweep of the AN/APY-10 radar moved with mechanical precision. A sharp, bright return flickered on the edge of the display. It was no longer a ghost or a distant smudge. It was a solid contact. The operator adjusted the electronic gain. The signal was sharp and aggressive. He called out the bearing. The contact was at bearing 350. The range was 55 miles. The target was closing fast. His voice was steady, but the pitch was higher than usual. The tactical coordinator leaned over the shoulder of the operator. He looked at the velocity vector. The unknown aircraft was traveling at 700 miles per hour. It was climbing through 15,000 feet. The coordinator checked the electronic support measures. The yellow strobe on his console began to blink rapidly. The sound in his headset was a rhythmic, digital chirp. It was the signature of an AN/AWG-9 radar. It was the eyes of a hunter. The coordinator knew the Iranians were the only ones still flying the F-14 Tomcat. He knew the power of that radar. It was designed to find targets at long range. Now, that radar was pointed directly at them. The mission commander sat in the left seat of the cockpit. He felt the vibration of the 4 jet engines through his boots. The morning light slashed through the cockpit glass like a blade. It created long, sharp shadows across the instrument panel. He gripped the control yoke. The leather was cold and slightly damp from his palms. He looked at the navigation display. They were well within international airspace. He pressed the transmit button on the center console. He spoke into the international distress frequency. He identified his aircraft as a United States Navy flight. He gave their coordinates as 26 degrees north and 55 degrees east. He warned the approaching fighter to turn away. He told the pilot they were in international waters. There was no reply from the F-14 Tomcat. Only the empty hiss of static came back. Through the headsets, the radar operator reported the range again. The distance was 40 miles. The Tomcat was accelerating. It was now at Mach 1.2. A sonic boom would be rippling across the water far below. The P-8 Poseidon was a large aircraft. It was based on a commercial airliner. It was not built for a dogfight. It was a slow, heavy target. The pilot looked at the fuel gauges and the engine instruments. Everything was in the green, but he felt a deep sense of dread. The air in the cockpit smelled of ozone and heated electronics. The hum of the cooling fans felt like a scream. The tactical coordinator watched the threat display. The yellow strobe turned into a solid red line. The chirp in the headsets became a continuous, high-pitched whine. This was the transition. The Tomcat was no longer searching for them. It had a hard track. It was a fire control lock. The coordinator shouted to the flight deck. He told the commander they were being painted. He warned that a launch could happen at any second. The pilot reacted instantly. He pushed the throttles to the firewall. The engines roared with a deep, guttural sound. He kicked the rudder and banked the heavy plane to the left. The wings groaned under the sudden stress. The horizon tilted at a sharp angle. Inside the back of the plane, the crew grabbed their armrests. The force of the turn pressed them into their seats. Loose flight manuals slid across the floor. The mission commander repeated the warning on the radio. His voice was now loud and urgent. He told the Iranian pilot to break his lock. He warned that they were a non-threatening patrol aircraft. Still, the only sound was the static of the radio and the whine of the lock. The red light on the console was a steady, baleful eye. The distance was 30 miles. The Tomcat was positioned high above them. It was in the classic attacking position. It was diving down from the sun. The radar operator reported the range every 10 seconds. 25 miles, 20 miles. The speed of the closure was terrifying. The P-8 Poseidon was trying to dive toward the water. The pilot hoped the sea clutter might confuse the older radar. The altimeter spun rapidly. 25,000 feet. 20,000 feet. The air became thicker and more turbulent. The aircraft bucked and surged in the morning heat. The smell of burning jet fuel was faint but present. Every second felt like a minute. The crew waited for the next sound. They waited for the sound of a missile launch. The silence of the enemy was the most frightening part. It meant there was no room for negotiation. The battle had already begun. 6:38 in the morning. The Iranian pilot shifted his weight. The G-suit squeezed his legs. He ignored the frantic English voices on his headset. To him, they were just noise. He adjusted the radar screen. The target was large. It was a clear, steady return. He reached for the cooling switch. Liquid nitrogen began to flow. It cooled the seeker head of the Phoenix missile. The system was ready. The cockpit was a cramped space. It smelled of ozone and synthetic rubber. The sun was a white-hot spear. It pierced through the plexiglass. The pilot squinted. He pulled the stick back. The Tomcat rose. It entered the thin, cold air at 35,000 feet. He was now a predator miles above the sea. On the Poseidon, the situation was grim. The electronic warfare officer shouted. The warning tone changed. It was no longer a sweep. It was a continuous wave. The Iranian was ready to fire. The pilot yanked the yoke. The heavy plane groaned. Metal plates beneath the floorboards shrieked. The crew felt the gravity pull. It was a desperate, slow dance. The mission commander checked the screen. The distance was 15 miles. The Tomcat was closing at a terrifying rate. He knew the Phoenix missile. It was a long-range killer. It did not need to be close. The Iranian was just waiting for the perfect angle. The red lights on the console were blinding. The cabin air felt thin. Every breath was a struggle. The pilot of the F-14 Tomcat felt the lock-on. The tone in his ears was a solid, unwavering scream. He felt a surge of adrenaline. His thumb rested on the red button. He checked the range. 12 miles. He was in the heart of the weapon's envelope. There was no escape for the American plane. He inhaled the dry, bottled air. He waited for the final command. The P-8 crew knew. This was not a game. This was an execution. The tactical coordinator braced his feet. He stared at the red strobe. It was the last thing he would see clearly. The morning light was a brilliant, cruel gold. The silence between the crew was absolute. They were waiting for the end. 6:40 in the morning, on the 9th of March, 2026. The tension over the Strait of Hormuz finally snapped. Inside the cockpit of the F-14 Tomcat, the world narrowed down to a single glowing green circle on the head-up display. The Iranian pilot felt the sweat slicking his palms inside his flight gloves. He took one final, ragged breath of bottled oxygen. He whispered a short prayer. Then, he squeezed the trigger on the front of the control stick. The mechanical release was instantaneous. The heavy AIM-54 Phoenix missile dropped from the underbelly of the Tomcat. For half a heartbeat, the half-ton weapon fell in total silence, a massive white shape tumbling into the slipstream. Then, the solid fuel rocket motor ignited with a sound like the sky itself was tearing open. A blinding column of orange and white fire punched backward from the missile. The heat blast was so intense, it washed over the blading tensed the daced F-14's fuselage, momentarily bleaching the cockpit in a harsh, chemical light. The smell of burning propellant, sharp, acrid, and metallic, seeped through the air vents, filling the pilot's mask. The Tomcat bucked upward as it was suddenly relieved of the missile's weight. The pilot felt the violent jolt travel through the airframe and into his spine. The Phoenix missile shrieked away from the rail. It left a dense, twisting rope of white smoke that hung in the still morning air. Within 3 seconds, the weapon was already traveling faster than the speed of sound. It began a steep, aggressive climb, seeking the thin air of the upper atmosphere to maximize its range. The roar of its engine faded into a high-pitched whistle, then into nothingness as it accelerated toward Mach 5. The Iranian pilot watched the white streak move toward the horizon. He felt a cold, hollow sensation in his chest. There was no taking it back. The fire was in the sky, 5 miles away and 10,000 feet higher. The world inside the P-8 Poseidon changed forever. The electronic warfare officer's console erupted in a series of frantic, high-pitched screams. The steady red light of the radar lock was replaced by a flashing crimson strobe. A new voice filled the headsets of the 9 crew members, a digital, synthesized voice that was cold and urgent. It repeated the word launch over and over again. The tactical coordinator's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at his screen. A new icon had appeared. It was a tiny triangle, moving at a speed that defied logic. It was a vampire. It was inbound. The mission commander in the cockpit didn't wait for a command. He slammed his left hand forward, pushing the throttles into the emergency override gates. The two jet engines of the Poseidon roared, the turbine blades spinning at their absolute mechanical limit. He grabbed the yoke with both hands and wrenched it to the right. The heavy aircraft groaned under the sudden G-load. Metal floorboards beneath the crew's feet shrieked as the airframe twisted. The horizon in the cockpit windows spun at a sickening angle. The brilliant morning sun flashed across the glass, momentarily blinding the pilots as they dove for the sea. In the back of the aircraft, the crew members scrambled to tighten their harnesses. One operator's headset was ripped from his head by the force of the turn. The cabin was filled with the sound of straining engines and the relentless, rhythmic chirping of the missile warning system. The air smelled of hot electronics and the sudden, sharp ozone of the overstressed electrical systems. The mission commander's voice was a roar. Over the internal comms, he ordered the release of countermeasures. At the touch of a button, the P-8's defensive systems responded. Bundles of chaff and burning magnesium flares were ejected from the rear of the aircraft. They bloomed in the air like white-hot flowers, creating a cloud of false targets in the sky. The pilot kicked the rudder, fishtailing the massive plane to broaden the signature of the flares. He was sweating through his flight suit. His eyes were locked on the altimeter as it spun downward. 20,000 feet, 18,000, 15,000. The tactical coordinator watched the vampire on his screen. The Phoenix missile was not fooled by the flares. Its internal radar was too powerful. It was ignoring the decoys. It was adjusting its flight path with terrifying precision. The gap was closing. 12 miles, 10 miles, 8 miles. The digital voice in their ears was now a continuous, unwavering scream. The crew knew they were flying in a coffin. They were out of time. They were out of altitude. The white streak in the distance was no longer a line. It was a point of light, growing larger with every heartbeat. 6:41 in the morning. The final seconds of the engagement were a blur of violent motion and blinding light. The AIM-54 Phoenix missile, traveling at more than 4,000 kilometers per hour, closed the final 2 miles in a fraction of a breath. Inside the P-8 Poseidon, the mission commander saw the white-hot point of light in his side window. He had no time to scream. He pulled the yoke back into his stomach in a final, instinctive attempt to bank the belly of the plane toward the threat. The warhead punched through the port side of the fuselage just behind the wing root. The impact was not a sound at first, but a massive, blunt shock that compressed the air inside the cabin. The 135-pound high-explosive blast fragmentation warhead detonated instantly. The force of the explosion shattered the main wing spar and tore a hole 10 meters wide in the side of the aircraft. Thousands of tungsten cubes shredded the interior, turning the sophisticated radar consoles and workstations into twisted, jagged scrap metal. Turning the sophisticated radar consoles and workstations into twisted, jagged scrap metal. The port engine was swallowed by a fireball that reached temperatures of 3,000 degrees. The wing itself, heavy with thousands of pounds of jet fuel, was ripped clean off the fuselage. The aircraft began a violent, high-speed roll to the left. The remaining engine, still at full power, drove the nose of the plane into a vertical spiral. Inside the cabin, the sudden decompression sucked everything not bolted down, flight manuals, headsets, and debris out into the freezing slipstream. The 9 crew members were subjected to crushing G-forces that snapped necks and limbs. Those not killed by the initial blast were rendered unconscious as the cabin pressure vanished. On the radar screen of the F-14 Tomcat, the large green blip simply vanished. It was replaced by a cloud of smaller, flickering returns debris reflecting the radar energy. For a few seconds before falling out of the scan, the Iranian pilot watched the fireball erupt in the distance. It was a brilliant orange bloom against the morning blue, a temporary sun that cast long shadows across the water 5 miles below. A massive plume of black, oily smoke began to trail the falling wreckage. The P-8 Poseidon did not fall as one piece. The immense aerodynamic pressure of the spin tore the fuselage apart. The tail section snapped off and tumbled end over end, its white paint scorched black by the explosion. The main body of the aircraft, now a burning tube of metal, plummeted toward the Gulf. The sound of the wind screaming through the open hull was the only thing left. There were no parachutes. There was no radio call. There was only the sound of a billion-dollar machine being reduced to junk in the span of 3 seconds. The Iranian pilot felt the shockwave of the detonation hit his own aircraft, a sharp jolt that rattled his canopy. He kicked his rudder hard to the left, wrenching the nose of the Tomcat away from the debris field. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving against the harness. He looked over his shoulder. The fireball was already fading, replaced by a growing smear of black smoke that pointed like a finger toward the sea. The victory felt cold. He reached for his radio to report the kill, his voice trembling as he confirmed the target was destroyed. 6:43 in the morning. The sky over the Strait of Hormuz was no longer a pristine sheet of morning gold. It was scarred by a long, vertical smear of oily black smoke that reached from 30,000 feet down to the water's edge. The wreckage of the P-8 Poseidon hit the surface of the Persian Gulf with a sound like a thunderclap. The largest section, the forward fuselage and the cockpit, slammed into the waves at 400 knots. The impact did not just break the metal, it pulverized it. A massive plume of white water and gray spray erupted into the air, reaching 50 meters high before collapsing back into the churning sea. Smaller pieces of the aircraft continued to rain down for minutes. Shredded insulation, pieces of seat cushions, and fragments of the composite tail section fluttered through the air like blackened autumn leaves. They hissed as they touched the water, the heat of the explosion meeting the cold salt spray. Within 60 seconds, the primary splash zone was marked by a massive, spreading slick of jet fuel. The rainbow-colored film of kerosene smoothed the choppy waves, creating an eerie, mirror-like surface in the middle of the debris field. The smell was overwhelming. A pungent chemical mixture of burnt plastic, hydraulic fluid, and high-octane fuel. High above, the Iranian F-14 Tomcat maintained a wide, circular orbit at 20,000 feet. The pilot banked his aircraft, looking down through the plexiglass canopy. He could see the white foam of the impact site and the dark shadow of the oil slick. There was no sign of life. No yellow life rafts inflated. No orange survival smoke signaled from the water. The sea was indifferent, slowly swallowing the heavy remains of the billion-dollar aircraft. The radar intercept officer in the back seat confirmed the lack of any emergency beacon signals. The airwaves were silent. The Iranian pilot felt the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, heavy realization. He checked his fuel gauges, the afterburner run, and the high-speed climb had consumed a massive amount of his internal supply. He tapped the radio transmit button on his throttle. His voice was thick and slightly raspy as he spoke to Bandar Abbas Control. He reported the target destroyed at coordinates 26 degrees 40 minutes north, 55 degrees 2 minutes east. He confirmed the splash. He then requested a vector for his return to base. The controller's voice came back through the headset, frantic and high-pitched. The news of the kill was already spreading through the command chain. The pilot was ordered to return immediately at maximum endurance speed. He was warned that American carrier-based fighters were already being detected launching from the north. The hunter was now becoming the hunted. The pilot pulled the stick back and banked the Tomcat toward the Iranian coastline. He did not look back at the smoke. He focused on the horizon, watching for the silhouettes of F-18 fighters that he knew would be coming for him. Behind him, the smoke from the explosion began to drift and dissipate in the morning wind. The oil slick continued to grow, caught in the slow, rhythmic currents of the strait. Below the surface, the heavier pieces of the Poseidon, the engines, the landing gear, and the main radar array settled onto the sandy floor of the Gulf, 60 meters down. They came to rest in the darkness, surrounded by rising bubbles of trapped air. The mission of Combat Air Crew 11 had ended in a single, violent heartbeat. The surface of the water was nearly still again, save for the floating wreckage and the growing smell of war. 7 in the morning on the 9th of March, 2026, the deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford, positioned 100 miles to the south in the Gulf of Oman, erupted into a frenzy of controlled violence. The news of the P-8's disappearance had reached the bridge exactly 4 minutes earlier. The silent radar screens and the sudden loss of data link connectivity had told the story before the first reports of a missile launch arrived. The ship's whistle blew a single, long blast that vibrated through the steel hull. General Quarters. Across the 4.5-acre flight deck, the yellow-shirted aircraft handlers moved with practice speed. The air was filled with the high-pitched scream of auxiliary power units. On catapults 1 and 2, two F-18 Gulf Growlers from Electronic Attack Squadron 131 were already hooked to the shuttles. Their mission was to blind the Iranian coastal radars and protect the strike force. Behind them, 4 F-18 Super Hornets of Strike Fighter Squadron 87 were fueled and armed with AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles. The Air Boss, perched in the primary flight control tower, gave the command to launch the alert fighters. The deck edge hummed with the power of the electromagnetic aircraft launch system. With a sound like a giant whip cracking, the first Super Hornet was hurled into the air, reaching 160 knots in less than 300 feet. The pilot retracted his gear and banked hard to the north, his afterburners 2 points of white-hot light against the pale blue sky. Inside the Carrier Intelligence Center, the atmosphere was frozen in a state of professional shock. Officers and analysts stared at the last known coordinates of the Poseidon. The loss of 9 sailors was a weight that had not yet fully settled, pushed aside by the immediate requirements of the tactical situation. The admiral of Carrier Strike Group 12 stood at the central plotting table. His face was a mask of cold fury. He ordered the entire strike group to increase speed to 30 knots. The cruisers and destroyers of the screen began to churn the water into massive white wakes as they moved into defensive formation. The radar screens across the fleet were now lit up with activity. Every AN/SPY-6 radar was operating at maximum power. They tracked the lone Iranian F-14 Tomcat as it fled toward the coast of Iran. The Super Hornets were closing the distance at Mach 1.4. They were being vectored by an E-2 Charlie Hawkeye orbiting high above the fleet. The airwaves were no longer silent. They were filled with the rapid-fire coordinates and weapons-free authorizations of a superpower preparing to strike back. The tension on the bridge of the USS Gerald R forward was thick enough to feel. Every sailor knew that. The threshold had been crossed. This was no longer a game of shadows or diplomatic posturing. An American aircraft had been shot down in international airspace. The rules of engagement had changed in an instant. The wind over the flight deck carried the sharp, biting smell of jet exhaust and salt spray. A scent that now felt like the smell of an impending storm. The fleet was moving north, and the hammer was about to fall. 8 in the morning on the 9th of March, 2026, the world woke to a nightmare. In Tehran, the state-run news agency issued a defiant bulletin. They claimed the American aircraft had violated sovereign Iranian airspace. They described the shootdown as a necessary act of national defense. The statement was read by a man in a dark military uniform. His voice was cold and steady. Behind him, the flag of the Islamic Republic hung motionless. He warned that any retaliation would be met with a crushing response. He spoke of the Persian Gulf as a graveyard for invaders. In Washington, the reaction was swift and furious. The president was awakened at 4 in the morning local time. Within 30 minutes, the Situation Room was filled with the highest-ranking officials in the land. The Secretary of Defense stood before a wall of monitors. He watched the replay of the carrier launches. He saw the coordinates, where the Poseidon had vanished. The atmospheric pressure in the room was suffocating. Every man and woman present knew the gravity of the moment. 9 American sailors were gone. The red line had been crossed. The Pentagon issued a formal statement within the hour. It was short and blunt. It described the attack as an unprovoked act of aggression in international airspace. It stated that the United States would take all necessary measures to protect its forces and interests. Across the globe, military bases moved to force protection, Condition Delta. In Europe, NATO commanders held emergency meetings. In Asia, the 7th Fleet moved to high alert. The geopolitical gears were off a sense, turning with a terrifying speed. The world held its breath. The Iranian military was not idle. Along the coast, anti-ship missile batteries were moved out of their hidden bunkers. They were positioned in the rugged mountains overlooking the strait. Radar systems began to scan the horizon. The Iranian Navy scrambled every available fast attack boat. They swarmed into the narrow waters like hornets. They carried Chinese-made C-802 missiles. Each one was a threat to the massive American carriers. The tension in CA, the region was no longer a simmer. It was a boil. In the United States, the public reaction was a mixture of shock and anger. News channels played the few seconds of the explosion on a continuous loop. Social media was a storm of hashtags and demands for action. Military families waited by their phones, hearts heavy with dread. The shadow of a major war moved across the planet. Diplomacy was failing. The voices of the hawks were growing louder in every capital. The time for words was nearly over. The United States Navy began moving more assets into the region. 2 additional carrier strike groups were ordered to change course toward the Arabian Sea. Attack submarines moved into silent patrol positions. Strategic bombers were fueled and armed at bases in Guam and Diego Garcia. The logistical machinery of a superpower was fully engaged. The cost of the single Phoenix missile was now being calculated in billions of dollars and potential thousands of lives. The warning had been given. The next move would be written in fire. 9 in the morning on the 9th of March, 2026. The sun was now high and merciless, beating down on the empty expanse of the Strait of Hormuz. 3 hours had passed since the first radar lock. At coordinates 26 degrees 40 minutes north, 105 degrees 2 minutes east, the surface of the water was deceptive. From a distance, it looked like any other patch of the Persian Gulf. But as the first search and rescue helicopters arrived, the reality of the morning became clear. The twin rotors of 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters from the USS Gerald R beat the air into a frenzy. They hovered at 50 feet, the downdraft creating massive circular patterns in the oil slick. The crews looked down into a graveyard of floating debris. The sea was covered in a thick, shimmering film of jet fuel that smelled of scorched metal and chemicals. Thousands of white fragments, pieces of the P-8's pressurized hull, bobbed in the swells like broken bones. There were no orange life rafts. There were no signal flares. There was only the sound of the wind and the rhythmic thumping of the helicopters. The rescue divers peered through the open doors, their eyes scanning the rainbow-colored water. They saw a flight helmet floating nearby, its visor shattered. They saw a single, charred life vest tangled in a piece of wiring. The vast majority of the aircraft, along with its 9 crew members, had already settled into the dark silence of the seabed 60 meters below. The divers knew there would be no one to save. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was a recovery, and a witness to a crime of war. As the helicopters circled, the horizon to the south began to fill with the silhouettes of the American response. The guided missile destroyer, USS Mason, moved into the debris field, its bow cutting through the oil slick with a low, mournful hiss. Sailors stood along the rails in silent formation, their eyes fixed on the primus wreckage. On the horizon, more ships appeared, cruisers, destroyers, and the massive, unmistakable shape of the aircraft carrier. The sky above was filled with the constant roar of F-18 fighters, their wings heavy with missiles, standing guard over the hollowed-out patch of ocean. The Iranian F-14 Tomcat had long since disappeared behind the mountains of the coastline, but its single strike had changed the world. The silence over the crash site was heavy, broken only by the crackle of military radios reporting the finality of the search. The 9 names of the crew would soon be read in a quiet room in Washington, while the engines of war continued to howl across the Gulf. The oil slick continued to spread, a dark stain on the silver water that the tide could not wash away. The battle of the morning was over. But the silence that followed was not one of peace. It was the heavy, breathless pause before a global storm. The debris of the Poseidon drifted slowly toward the Iranian coast, carried by the current, while the American fleet gathered its strength for the coming night. The sun glinted off the floating wreckage one last time, before a swell rolled over it, pulling the last pieces of the morning into the depths. The sea was still, but the world was on fire.